not ready? Okay. Hello? 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 Let's go over. Hi, everyone. If you could begin to take your seats, welcome. We're about to start in a minute or two. So I remember when we started planning this event, a year and a half ago, two friends and I sat down for a pint at the Anchor Pub in Cambridge. We sat down to drink and discuss the possibility of holding a conference on Trinitarian Ontology. And apparently, these Trinitarian Ontologies had to be new. And I remember well those initial discussions because it was actually the same week that my wife and I found out she was pregnant with twin boys. We went to the doctor, and they told us there were 3 heartbeats. There was my wife's, there was the child, and there was another child. And after the initial shock, my wife put her hand on her belly, and through tears, she cried out, "I'm a Trinity!" and I looked her in the eyes and I said, "Oh, sweetie, that's Arianism." So I remember that week well. And I remember the very night us 3 began to plan the conference. I remember there was a lot of speaker suggestions, there was a lot of grant proposal ideas, there was a lot of themes put forward, and there was a lot of pints. But more than that, there was a fire. A fire flaming with the shared conviction that our world is floating atop of nothing at all. A shared belief that we each had that our contemporary world is built on nothing, floating through empty space without any moorings, no up or down, forever falling. To what could we compare the modern ontology? Our modern ontology is like a fly carried too far out to sea that suddenly realizes it has nowhere to land. Flapping furiously, trying to suspend itself midair by its own might, until it finally sinks into the deep. Indeed, while there was once God, or being, or even turtles all the way down, now there is seemingly nothing at all. As if the very question of ontology merits nothing but a blank stare or a pity laugh. Not only have we cut the branch out from under us, but we seem to be enjoying the fall, blissfully denying that there is any rock bottom for us to crash into. We've no grounds, no ontology, save an inherited materialism that is more assumed than proved, and which cannot provide answers to the questions of our minds, let alone the longings of our hearts. Without a God above, we are suspended from nothing but our own suspenders, like that baron who tried to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. Without a God who's 3 in 1, 1 in many, we lose any shred of unity and diversity, any unified meaning behind the chaos of different cultures, experiences, and ideologies. Without a triune God who upholds the tension of the one and many, our planet's greatest thinkers are left rotating between a total oneness that excludes all diversity and difference and a postmodern relativism that sees no unified truth at all. Without a higher ontology of persons in relation, pop culture ricochets back and forth between absolutizing the selfish individual or abandoning any authentic self at all in the desperate search for affirmation and identity from others. Without a triune community, there is no longer an eternal love baked into reality. All relational ties and sacred rights are now but social constructs we've invented and can rewrite as we please. Without the mystery of the Trinity at the center of all things, all else becomes mysterious. It is the light that one cannot directly look at, but in light of which all else is seen. Without the three in one, there would be no ground beneath us, no Father above us, no Son for us, no Spirit within us. These were our convictions that night. And now the inkling fire of those thoughts has come to fruition. Yesterday we got to hear Trinitarian ontology asserted, then negated, then reasserted through negation. We heard bold declarations yesterday of eternal love, and we heard those same declarations tempered by temporality. We heard the role of the Trinity in thinking, to then have thinking challenged by feeling. Our hopes for the weekend have not been disappointed, at least not mine. And I know today is going to be equally as exciting with the lineup of speakers we've got coming for you. It is my honor to officially welcome you to day 2 of the new Trinitarian Ontologies Conference. Our first panel today is on metaphysics, and it's chaired by my friend Matthew Fell. Matthew's a PhD candidate here at Cambridge. His fascinating research seeks to bring Thomas Aquinas' anthropology and epistemology into dialogue with the evolutionary sciences concerning the origins of human language. Could you please join me in welcoming Matthew and the first panel for the day?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to day 2. I have the great privilege and honor of chairing this panel of very esteemed speakers looking at a wonderful topic. Our subject this morning is metaphysics, being, essence, and truth. And our first speaker is Professor John Betz of the University of Notre Dame. Professor Betz's expertise covers modern German thought from the 18th to the 20th century, and he has greatly served the academic community represented here today through his work on the Jesuit philosopher and theologian Eric Schwarzwälder. Key publications include After Enlightenment, the post-secular vision of J.G. Heyman, and a critical edition of Schwarzwälder's Analogia Entis. Professor Betz, Cambridge warmly invites you to come and share your paper, Being, Essence, Identity, and Ecstasy.
In the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. First of all, thanks to Rowan, Brian, Austin, Matthew, Jonathan, and all who've helped to make this conference possible. It's a real honor to be here. The title of my paper is, I admit, rather inelegant. Being, Essence, Identity, and Ecstasy, an essay in Trinitarian Metaphysics. It's indeed quite cumbersome.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Sorry, I couldn't follow the first instruction. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So first of all, thanks to Rowan, Ryan, Matthew, Austin, Ollie, Jonathan, all who've helped to make this conference possible. The title of my paper is, I admit, rather inelegant, indeed quite cumbersome, but it encapsulates what I want to say today about the relationship between philosophical and theological metaphysics. It just needs to be unpacked in a series of steps, as on a ladder that leads from the concept of being all the way up to Trinitarian theology, and if I have time, back down again. So let me begin with the first word, being. As Hegel pointed out, no word is more abstract, indeed poorer, so poor as to be nothing. But at the same time, paradoxically, no word is richer, for all that is, obviously, is, such that being, notwithstanding its poverty, or precisely because of it, somehow contains everything. And I dare say that Hegel was onto something, given what this suggests about the Trinity as an empty fullness or a kenotic plenitude. What is relevant here, however, is simply the curious fact that the concept of being not only resists identification, but actually falls apart as soon as we start to think about it. Take the simple statement, it is. It seems banal, but on reflection it turns out to be mysteriously ambiguous. For on the one hand, if you're an essentialist, you'll immediately want to know either the subject or the predicate that this statement implies. In plain English, you'll want to know what is said to be what. If you're an existentialist, on the other hand, you'll immediately pick up on the statement's existential import and the givenness or even gratuity of whatever is said to be, which is something more than what logicians mean by existential quantification. In sum, while the essentialist hears quiddity, the existentialist hears novelty. But if you're a thinker, I dare say you'll hear the statement stereophonically, with two ears, picking up on being's dynamic range. By the same token, you'll see the world with two eyes, and consequently, with a depth perception that allows you to see the doubling of being into essence and existence as the doubling of transcendence in immanence. In other words, you'll be able to see the doubling of being into essence and existence as a double of being itself, which is in the double as its original archetype, but at the same time beyond it, as an identity of essence and existence. Now, admittedly, this last claim could stand to be elaborated, but none of this is really new, the title of our conference notwithstanding. I am simply rehearsing what Aquinas meant in drawing a fundamental distinction between essentia and existentia, or what the late Schelling also meant in distinguishing between what a thing is, quid est, and that a thing is, quod est, and what, in this past century, Eric Shivara meant by the analogy of being. But sometimes it's worth restating those things that, however old, remain ever new. So, to summarize our first step, philosophical reflection shows that the concept of being, like the wave-particle duality of light, immediately parses into being and essence, or more precisely, into essence and existence. But if this is the first step of any fundamental ontology, if being inevitably breaks open, as it were, into essence and existence, then the consequences are immense. Negatively, it means that we are left without any firm philosophical foundation or means of atonement, and that the modern quest for a foundation other than God, whether it be sought in the self, in science, or in logic, whether in Descartes' cogito, Bacon's novum organum, or in the attempted mastery of modern analytic philosophy, turns out to be an illusory and ultimately vain grasping after divinity along the lines of Genesis 3. The same applies a fortiori to every univocal ontology from Deleuze to Badiou. For simply put, being is ontically and noetically too dynamic to contain, however much philosophical muscle we bring to bear on it. Indeed, even Hegel fails to contain it, however brilliantly he tried to master it. For it is not that being itself is a dialectical movement, but that what appears to be a dialectic is really an analogy pointing beyond itself. This much, I think, Christian theology is obliged to say against Hegel and against any other philosophy that would attempt to cram everything into what Charles Taylor has aptly termed the immanent frame. For if we can learn anything from Shivara, it is that such attempts simply don't work, no more than in physics we can reduce waves to particles or vice versa. But this negative turns out to be the flip side of a positive, indicating that being like light is a mysterious analogy of a more wonderful archetype. This, then, I take to be the first step of any philosophical ontology, and not just one that would serve the purposes of a Trinitarian ontology. But precisely here, en route to a Trinitarian ontology, we encounter and have to deal with another titan of modern philosophy, namely Heidegger. For just as Hegel did Christian theology a favor by making the doctrine of the Trinity worthy of thought, indeed the heart of thought itself, Heidegger did Christian theology a favor by rehabilitating the question of being, and thereby renewing, together with Husserl and Scheler, the conversation between medieval and modern philosophy that had been foreclosed since Descartes. Of course, Heidegger's compatibility with Christian theology is another question, which, as with Hegel, raises the question of how far one can travel with him. Is he a fellow traveler on the road to Emmaus, or do his Holzwege lead elsewhere? Obviously, this question is too complicated to answer here, and others like Judith or Cyril O'Regan could answer it much better than I could. But given how much Heidegger has dominated discussions of ontology in our time, captivating even the best of us, we have to consider what he has to say, even if we ultimately have to bid him farewell on our way to a properly Trinitarian ontology. So let me try to summarize what we can learn from him, at the very least in the spirit of ab hoste concilium. Firstly, we have to appreciate Heidegger for having resurrected the question of being and for having done so at a time when it had largely been buried, having been reduced either to Platonic ideology or Aristotelian etiology or the self-positing of an absolute subject, as in German idealism, or what is even more banal, the various forms of logical positivism and modern analytic philosophy. In short, we have to appreciate Heidegger for having distinguished between the question of being, the Seinsfrage, and the question of essence, the Wesensfrage, and thereby saved philosophy, and indirectly theology, from a one-sided essentialism. Moreover, for highlighting the difference not just between being and essence, but also by extension between being in form, being in logic, being in definition, being in cause, and indeed between being and the whole compass of cause and effect. After all, is being really thought if, before all else, before it is thought, it is divided into cause and effect? Or has such thinking not obscured something that in our modern frame of mind we have missed, namely the givenness of being in beings, which is neither a cause nor an effect, nor indeed anything, being curiously hidden in everything from every essentializing gaze? There is therefore something that Christian theology can learn from Heidegger. Indeed, I dare say that no Trinitarian ontology of the future can fail to appreciate his best insights, however indebted to the Christian tradition they may be. Chiefly that there's a difference between being and beings, that existence is irreducible to essence, that to be is a gift, and that the gift of being and beings bears some kind of kenotic signature. And in this respect, looking back to Martin Bieler's talk, we can be grateful for the work of Ferdinand Ulrich, who, building on Gustav Sievert, put Heidegger in conversation with Thomas Aquinas to produce a remarkable philosophy centered on the kenotic non-subsistence of being in beings, which brings us back to Hegel, but also takes us one step further, heralding a Trinitarian understanding of being as poor, but rich in love. The question now, though, is whether Heidegger succeeded in thinking the question of being. My own view is that he does not. Firstly, because what he means by being, even in his late period, is nothing transcendent, nothing beyond the immanent economy of beings, but simply the event of beings coming into their own, which is to say, corresponding with an historical destiny. Secondly, because he elevates being over the other transcendentals, obscuring their final unity. Thirdly, and more to the point here, because he pushes back so hard against Platonism that the question of essences and real ideas virtually disappears, and along with it, rather terrifyingly, the whole question of real ideals and moral standards. Indeed, any essential dimension to which the human being might be ordered, any ordo essentiarum aeternarum, is simply ruled out, which makes Heidegger just as radical an anti-Platonist as Nietzsche. In sum, denying from the start both any transcendence and any notion of an objective human essence, Heidegger leaves us with a doubly truncated ontology that oddly forecloses the very question of being it purports to pose. Now, Nietzsche, we might recall, liked to speak about lies in philosophy, but I dare say that his and Heidegger's double denial is one of them, which eventually led in Heidegger's case to a fabulously unbelievable philosophy of the fourfold. What is needed, therefore, I submit, even on philosophical grounds, is a more honest and reasonable philosophy of the kind Eric Pshivara tried to give us, namely an analogical philosophy, which remains open to being's double valence and is able to resist the temptations that come with it, both the temptation to reduce the question of existence to that of essence, as is the tendency of Platonism, which ultimately turns existence into an illusory projection of essence from above, as it were, and the opposing temptation to reduce the question of essence to that of existence, following Nietzsche and Heidegger, who turn all essences and values and all ideals into an illusory projection of existence from below, as it were. Positively stated, an analogical philosophy will appreciate not only the transcendence of being with regard to essence, but also the transcendence of essence with regard to being. Moreover, it will appreciate how in any given thing they intersect in their otherness. In admittedly abstruse terms, a full-fledged analogical philosophy will guard the mysterious intersection between being in and beyond essence, coming from Heidegger, and essence in and beyond being, which is Shivara's own formula for a creaturely metaphysics. And it will guard this crossing with a certain reverence, seeing it as the quasi-sacred site in thought, where the light of divine transcendence is ready to break through, revealing finite being to be the mysterious gift of transcendence, in the sense of both the subjective and objective genitive. Which brings me finally to our proper subject, theological or Trinitarian ontology. Before crossing the threshold, however, let us briefly review our steps. Beginning with the concept of being, we've seen that it mysteriously doubles into essence and existence, and that philosophy's inability to reconcile them is like a crack running through every immanent frame. I then suggested that an honest philosophy will remain standing before the mystery of their crossing, as at a crossroads where the questions of essence and existence, after mysteriously meeting, stretch to infinity. Which leaves us pondering in a Marian mode how in the world and where in the world essence and existence might coincide so perfectly as to reveal the meaning of being itself. Now, in some sense, we need look no further, because their mysterious intersection is actually everywhere, which makes everything significant, indeed everything a sign of the divine, since nothing would be were it not some kind of existing thing. But alas, these intersections are at the end of the day fleeting analogical moments, which leave us wondering where, if anywhere, essence and existence coincide without falling apart again. And so we come back to the question of whether there is any intersection, any crossing, at which they don't just coincide momentarily and analogically, but perfectly and completely, in such a way that reveals their actual identity. Now, given my language of crossings, you won't be surprised if I say that for Christians there is such an intersection, namely in Christ, and that Christ turns out to be the mysterious point around which the entire question of being turns. For if Christ is the one in whom divinity and humanity perfectly coincide, ontologically speaking, he is also the one in whom essence and existence perfectly coincide, and not merely as the perfect coincidence of a human essence and a human existence, and thus truly totus homo, but as the hypostatic identity of this temporal coincidence with the eternal identity of essence and existence proper to divinity, and thus truly totus Deus. In other words, Christ is the perfect man, having existed perfectly into the essence of his humanity, and the divine I am, whose essence is to exist. Of course, with Mary, we might ask, how can this be? For if in God essence and existence are identical, and in human beings they are non-identical, and if this difference is precisely what we mean by the analogy of being, which stresses the greater dissimilarity between divine and created being, how then are they united in Christ? And what does it mean to say with Balthasar that Christ is the concrete analogy of being, or better, the hypostatic identity of the analogy of being? Now, with so little time left, I've really set myself a task. And it would seem to be an impossible one, because the analogy of being would seem to leave us without hope that God and humanity could ever really meet, or that a human being whose essence is in God could ever fully be what it is. But here's the key. In Christ, mirabile dictu, the way of being which is given to us is one and the same. In other words, in Christ we see at once what it means for God to be and what it means for us to be, so that we can arrive at the meaning of being either through his humanity or through his divinity. But given the subject of our conference, I now conclude with what Christ reveals about the being of God in se, as Trinity, from which the meaning of our own being follows. Thus far, I've spoken of God as an identity of essence and existence. But of course, to say that God's essence is to exist also comes close, dangerously close, to pick up what Olivia was saying yesterday, to saying that God has to exist. In other words, it comes close to reducing God to a necessity of reason, an ens necessarium, and thus arguably to a conceptual idol, as Marion would tell us. Now, I don't think one has to see it this way, but it is a legitimate concern. So if we are not to stop with philosophical metaphysics and rest our gaze on an idol, we have to go on to theological metaphysics. recognizing that this philosophical conception is only a veil before a profounder Trinitarian mystery. For what the gospel suggests is that God's essence is not only to exist, according to the classical exegesis of Exodus 3:14, but also quite literally to exist, in the way that the Father exists in the Son, and the Son in the Father. Indeed, in such a way that God's essential identity is nothing other than a triune ecstasy, whereby the Father has no existence, no identity, except in the Son. The Son has no existence, no identity, except in the Father. And the Holy Spirit has no existence, no identity, except as the love of the Father and the Son. In other words, the gospel suggests that in and of themselves, the persons of the Trinity have no identity except in that essential love that makes them what they are. To be sure, this makes the Trinity appear to be nothing. And in this sense, Heidegger is right, that being is nothing, sein als nichts. The theological difference, however, and the decisive overcoming of Heidegger's ontological nihilism is that for theological ontology, which is to say for Trinitarian ontology, being is nothing but love. And the apparent nothingness of being is the nothingness that love makes of itself for the sake of the beloved. In conclusion, therefore, to venture a Trinitarian formula that perfects the philosophical formula, one might say that the Father is the eternal ground of the divine essence, which neither exists nor has any form except in the Son. Gregor of Nyssa says the same. That the Son is the eternal existence of this ground, its eternal splendor, and that the Spirit is the eternal return of God's existence into God's essence. This being pace Nietzsche, the real eternal return, of which Christ's life in the Spirit is the perfect image. A perfect reenactment for our sake of the one eternal gift and thanksgiving. Admittedly, I have made a lot of the etymological sense of existence as a standing outside oneself, but I think it's warranted, and that revelation itself confirms what is mysteriously right there under our noses in the everyday word for being. For looked at from every angle of the gospel, the identity of the persons of the Trinity would appear to consist precisely not in themselves, but rather outside themselves in the triune form of a reciprocal selfless ecstasy. Which brings me finally to the meaning of the last two terms of my title, identity and ecstasy, in which the meaning of being is fulfilled. For it is not that God is or has an identity before or apart from his ecstasy, but that he remains in himself, paradoxically, by going beyond himself. In other words, in God, immanence is transcendence, essence is existence, and identity is ecstasy, which is why in the title of my talk, Cambridgians, you will notice that there is no Oxford comma, though my natural fallen instinct, I admit, I prefer it. Yeah. So now, finally, from the perspective opened up by Trinitarian ontology, we have an answer to the question of being, and to that of our own being as a dynamic relation between essence and existence. For in Christ we can genuinely say that our essence is also to exist, which is to say outside ourselves, with this difference, that whereas God's essence is always already to exist in the triune manner just described, the creature's essence is a gerundive to exist, which means that existence is given to it as a task. Thus, according to a proshen analogy, whose primary analogate is Christ, to exist means to exist not statically in oneself, much less curved in upon oneself, which is the definition of sin, and a contradiction of being, but rather to exist as the word itself would suggest, namely ecstatically, to the point of living not for oneself, but wholly for God and neighbor. To be sure, one who so loves appears to be nothing. For in a sense, nothing of the individual qua individual remains. For in the Spirit of Christ, which is the spirit of thanksgiving, it has been given back. And yet, mysteriously, Now, like the triune God, it is in this way that we really exist. For as Christ says, such losing is really a finding, and such dying is the beginning of eternal life. Thank you.
Punctuation preferences aside, Professor Betz, thank you for a very stimulating and thorough paper. Our next speaker is Professor Chalamet from the University of Geneva. Professor Chalamet has a background in both music and theology, and his research to date concerns modern Protestant thought. He is a member of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, and the author of A Most Excellent Way, Essays on Faith, Hope and Love, The Challenge of History, Readings in Modern Theology, and has been the editor and contributor to a number of volumes, including 2014's Recent Developments in Trinitarian Theology. Professor Chalamet, we are very pleased to hear your paper entitled The Return of Metaphysics. Is this the way forward?
It's a great honor and also a great joy to be a part of this conference and of this panel with one of the towering Christian thinkers of our time, as well as with another distinguished scholar. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It took me a while to digest the news back in June that I would present a paper in this particular panel. My academic career can only go downhill from here, I'm afraid. But that's okay, I can live with that. Theologians should be wary of metaphysics, I think. But they should, of course, engage in ontology. Even if they may not be searching for new ontologies, they are certainly called to think always anew about the kind of ontologies which matter to Christian theology. First and foremost, the being or reality of God in relation to the being or reality of the world, of human beings, of creation as a whole. This, in a nutshell, is my position on the theme of this conference, and of course, the real work only begins as I unpack a little bit what I just stated in this opening summary. Metaphysics is a notoriously fuzzy word, and so an attempt at a provisional definition makes sense. By metaphysics, I understand reflection about being qua being, being as such, as well as about the very ground of being. And so metaphysics is one way of thinking and talking about being, I would argue. I would venture that metaphysics is one region within the larger field known as ontology. Christian theology as practiced by its most significant thinkers is not interested in being as such, but in God, the world, and humanity. Being as such, being qua being, is a philosophical theme, a philosophical abstraction with which Christian theology does not need to directly concern itself, unless one engages in the kind of philosophical theology which regularly springs up and which, to be sure, enjoys its own legitimacy. We should not imagine too quickly that when practitioners of metaphysics talk about being, they are talking about God, as confessed by Christians. In some striking passages, Aristotle may have conceived of God as life, but this did not lead the philosopher to think of God as desiring anything or even as relating to anything, as Giulio Maspero has pointed out. I think Protestant theology in modernity, following in this regard the 16th century Protestant reformers, was right to criticize metaphysical discourses and correct in wishing instead to base theology on the interpretation of the specific message of the scriptures. That philosophical elements never were absent from their interpretation of the scriptures or from ours today is quite obvious, and we should not be oblivious to that fact. But reaching some clarity on the intention of theology, of what theology's aim might be, is crucial. And on this point, I am convinced that that aim cannot be to establish a metaphysics or to revise metaphysics, although depending on the revision which is proposed, one's hesitations might be alleviated to a certain extent. The aim of Christian theology is to reflect on what the Christian faith is all about, namely God's revelatory action to Israel and to the world in his Son, Jesus Christ, in the power of the Spirit. And so you already notice the crucial term action in this statement. God's revelatory action is what Christian theology focuses on in a central way. That is not to say that being is suddenly dismissed, of course. God's revelatory action tells us something crucial about who God is and how God is. Not about being as such, but about the being of God and the being of the world and all the creaturely realities that make this world what it is. And so, as I see it, to ask who God is, what God's being is like, is in part an ontological question, but it is not a metaphysical question. Can there be, however, a Christian metaphysics? Can there be a sort of metaphysics which is not utterly uninformed by revelation, as David Bentley Hart puts it? If that is possible, then some will certainly wish to pursue it. To me, however, Christian metaphysics is an attempt at mixing oil and water, and we better leave metaphysics to the ancient, medieval, and modern philosophical project of thinking about God as first cause, etc. Christianity is the religion of the gospel, as Claude Jeffrey put it. And Christian theology should aim to remain quite centrally and decisively a theology of the gospel. What is the problem then with metaphysics? It has been accused, and it still is being accused, this conference notwithstanding, of many things. Of course, I find it intriguing that even contemporary thinkers who appear to promote metaphysics, theological metaphysics, admit that one of its problems is the tendency to consider reality and its ultimate origin or ground as a seamless ontological continuum, to quote again David Bentley Hart. Here it is the marginalizing of the infinite qualitative difference between the creator and the creatures, which is identified as a key flaw in metaphysical thought, the gap of which Giulio Maspero was talking yesterday. To mitigate this problem, according to David Bentley Hart and others, we need to turn to the analogy of being, properly construed, that is, as the opposite of any domesticating of God through a doctrine of being common to both the creator and the creatures. The doctrine of the analogy of being here implies a disruption. It introduces, I'm quoting, an unclosable ontological caesura, end of quote, in the place of a seamless ontological continuum. For, Hart adds, quote, there is no simple, uninterrupted ontological continuum as such between God and creation, end of quote. And this is the reason for a good amount of distrust versus metaphysics in the first place, and not just among many modern Protestants, but certainly also among them. Thinking theologically about being, not being as such, but God's being and the being of creation, remains an indispensable task for Christian theology today. This almost goes without saying. But how should we go about attempting to fulfill this task? Everything begins, it seems to me, with God's act in history. Without God's act in history, we could not utter a single genuinely theological, but also necessarily inadequate word about God's being or the being of the world. And God's act bears a name in Christian theology, Jesus of Nazareth, God's word uttered in the power of the Spirit, God as Emmanuel. That God is with God's people, that God does not wish to be without God's people, is arguably a key assertion of both the Old and the New Covenant, a statement found in some of its most decisive texts. The Gospel of Matthew is entirely framed by the word Emmanuel, Matthew 1:23, Matthew 28:20. As soon as we touch on these central features of the biblical narrative, we find ourselves in very different waters than the usual metaphysical waters. Here, freedom and love and freedom, are recognized as belonging to the foundation of being itself, as Giulio Maspero puts it, or rather, as I would suggest, as pertaining to the very core of who God is. To sustain itself, still today, Christian theology needs to let itself be nourished in green pastures and refreshed beside still waters. The pastures and waters of the Scriptures. There is its food, its sustenance, its starting point. God, as confessed by Christians and by Jews, is the one who bends down to the world because God hears the cry coming from God's people. This bending down, this hearing, is what many, I think, rightly miss in traditional metaphysics. Since traditional metaphysics quite often focuses on causality and going up the causal ladder, step after step, aims to attain a first cause. Instead of a metaphysics of a first unmoved cause, we need a theological ontology orientated and shaped from the get-go by the triune God's life-giving and liberating act. Let me end this brief presentation by saying a little bit more about the possible contours of such a theological ontology. The idea that Christian theology is inherently Trinitarian, that it does not merely become Trinitarian toward the end of the presentation of its content, but that it is Trinitarian right from the start, is still being debated. That is not a bad sign, for we need to ask ourselves what it means to begin straight away with a Trinitarian outlook. Here are some of the contours of the kind of Trinitarian theological ontology which I take to be most valuable today. We cannot retreat to a pre-covenantal God, that is, to a God who does not commit to being God for God's people, and who expects God's people to respond in a corresponding manner. This, of course, is another reason why thinking in abstract ways about being as such has no place within Christian theology proper. Even as, to repeat, it may still be of interest to certain kinds of philosophical theologies. A responsible Christian Trinitarian ontology centers on God as Father, Son, and Spirit without severing God's act ad extra from God's own life, but also without simply collapsing or confusing the two. This means that the person of the Logos cannot be considered independently from the historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, even as they cannot be conflated. This, of course, is another radical revision, to say the least, of traditional notions of God or of the divinity. God's own word and spirit are addressed, sent out, beyond God's own life, thereby creating everything that is not God, creating and recreating the world always anew. God's own life is a life of plenitude from all eternity. In that regard, God does not need the world. Such statements puzzle some, and one can understand the reason for this reaction. But these claims remain important, not simply to preserve God's freedom from the world, but precisely to express as best we can, that is, inadequately, for sure, God's freedom for the world. God's relation to the world is a relation characterized by grace and so, quite inescapably, by freedom. But God's freedom is not mere arbitrariness, as if God could just as well have decided not to create the world, or as if God had many different options, and after some deliberation, God had opted for this option rather than all the other possibilities. Although the word necessity may be too strong here, Christian theology needs to show how creation fits in with who God is, as love that constantly flows or circulates within God's own life as well as without. How do we know that God's love flows within God's own life? From the gospel narrative. And not simply in the fourth gospel, which is, of course, the default kind of source. Houtos estin ho huios mu ho agapetos en hoi eudokesa. This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. It's Matthew 3:17. If you look at Mark 1:11, you have, you are my son. The address is to the son directly. You are my son, the beloved. In you I am well pleased. And there's a lot to think about these two versions. In passages such as this one, it is as if a bit of the veil is being lifted. Something of God's own life, of the relation between the Father and his Son, is disclosed. It is in such passages that our always tentative and provisional thinking about God's triune life as a life of shared love finds its most adequate grounding. And it would be a grave mistake, it seems to me, to focus on these passages to the detriment of God's involvement in our history in order to redeem, that is, to liberate enslaved human beings and creatures. Christian theology must do better than bifurcate into speculations concerning God's immanent triune life and God's intent of liberation for God's people and God's creation. We need to find bridges between theologians correlating God's liberating action for and in the world with God's own life in God's self. And we need to make it clear that the center of gravity of Christian theology does not lie in God's own life, but in God's liberating act in history. The story of Jesus' baptism in the Jordan, alongside many other texts from the scriptures, may help us begin to do this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Chalamet, for your very eloquent and provocative paper. What a thrill this morning to listen to these papers, and one can already sense the very fruitful convergence and tensions between our first two papers. And I am now delighted to invite our final speaker, Lord Rowan Williams, up. Lord Williams is currently the Master of Magdalen College here in Cambridge and was previously the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. I trust that his work is highly regarded by many of us here today, and that his service to the British Church and his contribution to political discourse is admired and appreciated. The list of Lord Williams's publications is considerable, but I wish to mention three texts relevant to the theme of this conference. His 1987 work, Arius, Heresy and Tradition, The Edge of Words, God and the Habits of Language from 2014, and Christ, the Heart of Creation, published last year. This morning, the new Trinitarian Ontologies Conference is very pleased to receive Lord Williams to present his paper, Knowledge and Relation, Contemporary Transformations of Logos.
Let me echo my fellow speakers by saying a word of thanks to all those who've organized this extraordinary colloquium. A great deal of work and imagination has gone into this, and I think the number of attenders and the enthusiasm of the discussion speaks for itself. It's a privilege to be part of this. And I begin from a point which I think has already been made in outline by those who've spoken already. Fundamental to the Trinitarian vision of divine life is the conviction that it belongs to the very grammar of the divine that God's life is generative. It's impossible to think the divine simply as a one beyond relation or reciprocity. And part of the seed for this paper was Karl Barth's use of the initially rather startling language of the Trinity as God's self-repetition. God generates God, and in that sense, God repeats God. Part of the hinterland of Trinitarian language is, of course, the wisdom tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures and the paracanonical texts which elaborate them. We may be directed, as in Proverbs 8, to a wisdom that is before creation alongside God, or, as in Sirach 24 and Wisdom 7, to a wisdom that emanates from the divine like a breath, naming herself as God's active and glorious presence, a mirror of divine agency. But the underlying insight is one and the same. It is intrinsic to divine action that it, shall we say, resonates with itself, that it lives and acts in a self-generated harmonic. It gives itself back to be given back again. Its unity is not naked self-identity, but a moment of self-reflexivity that we could clumsily call a sort of eternal feedback. And the elaboration of the language of logos in Greek Christian theology is the canonical vehicle in early Christian thought for expressing this belief. Eternal reality is productive of its own reflection, inseparably moving into otherness and returning in what I've elsewhere called in a different context, a non-dual non-identity. God is God in acting so as to be God to God as reflection and as the generativity of that reflection itself as it returns to its source. God as source and word and spirit simultaneously. The idea of eternal logos and Sophia in the divine implies that we can think of the Trinitarian life not simply as God's repetition of God in Barthian terms, but as God's correspondence with God. Or to put it rather provocatively, the ontological basis of truth is God's self-relation. To grasp what truthfulness means, we look to this fundamental fact of divine self-resonance. Or, to borrow the characteristic vocabulary of the fourth gospel, especially in chapters 5 and 15, divine self-testimony. In the Johannine account of divine action, Father, Son, and Spirit testify, bear witness to one another. Each realizes and manifests what the other is. Each tells the truth about its other and about its other's relation to what is other to that other. Any language about this shows immediate strain, as my language has just done. But the basic point is actually not a complicated one. If God corresponds to God and so truly reflects God, that reflection is a witness to the truth reflected. And it's this self-relation and self-testimony that, for a theologian like Origen, say, enjoins the conclusion that God is rational, logikos, and that the eternal logos incarnate in Christ is witness to this rationality, a rationality understood as communicable life, life that can represent itself to itself in a non-identical fashion as, quoting Origen from the commentary on John, a true and faithful repetition of the divine. And if rationality is so understood as communicable life, non-identically repeated, we can see more readily why, for the Greek Christian tradition, logos in the created order is a dimension of finite reality that shares in the eternal logos. The very idea of intelligibility within the finite order is grounded in the character of infinite act as self-giving and self-correspondence. Hence the theme, central in Eastern Christian thought from Evagrius to Maximus and beyond, of mature knowledge as the fusion of the logos in the knower and the logos in what is known, so that the paradigm of knowledge is resonance and participation. I'll come back to that in a moment. But to use a very different idiom, the Aquinas of the De Veritate treats the eternal verbum cordis within the divine life as the model and source of intellection in finite minds. God's verbum, God's word, is God corresponding with God, manifesting God to God, expressing, in a lovely phrase that Aquinas takes from Richard of St. Victor, the sensus patris, the meaning of the Father. In and through the immeasurable diversity of finite particulars, considered, as it were, abstractly, as the modes in which divine life is imitable and participable, even independently of the actual existence of finite substances. The eternal Word, as the Father's infinite other, is the ground of the relation of all otherness, finite otherness, to the Father. It is the ground of finite realities sharing in divine act, the repetition of finite existence in the otherness of God, as well as the mode in which God is active in finite reality. Not as an external agency alongside finite act, but as infinite act corresponding to itself in and through the realm of finite diversity. Just as divine life corresponds to itself eternally and necessarily in the purely relational otherness of the divine persons. So the verbum in the finite subject is the subject in harmony with itself, in and through its relation with what is other, as it is also the object repeating itself in the knowing subject. Because in finite intellects knowing and existing are not the same reality, whereas in God they are the one identical eternal act that is divine life, our word, our verbum, doesn't constitute the otherness in which it is repeated. But in God, the Father eternally generates the word that is the self-correspondence of the Father's hypostatic being in another hypostasis, and also freely repeats that self-correspondence in the uttering through the word of the finite world in which intelligible form is apprehended through the reception by finite intellect of forms grounded in the ultimate structure of intelligibility, the divine word itself. So those who have argued, like our colleague Catherine Pickstock, that Thomas is primarily interested in the theological grounding of true knowledge in the De Veritate are not wrong, though it's somewhat misleading to suggest, as one other scholar has, that his explorations here are therefore not meant to be philosophical. I wouldn't want to drive that particular wedge in there. We could more accurately say that Aquinas is arguing that certain convictions about God are basic for making sense of truth-telling. If truth-telling does indeed presuppose a genuine modification of the intellect by what is known, rather than being a simply self-generated activity with no connection to what is other. And this is a philosophical point as far as it goes. But the convictions about God that are relevant here are convictions about the Trinitarian life, not about deity in general. And this should dispose us to take seriously the claim that Aquinas is advancing a consciously theological and specifically Trinitarian epistemology. So to try and sum up what I've been saying so far, I'm arguing that God's truthful or faithful correspondence with God's own divine life or act is the condition for all that we call intelligence or rationality. That God is logos or verbum is the ground for logos or verbum as it exists in finite reality. And since that self-resonance or self-correspondence is built into the doctrine of the Trinity, we have a clear connection between a Trinitarian ontology and a particular epistemology centered upon the idea of knowledge as resonance with logos, with the range of behaviors expressing and enacting attunement to the communicative, intelligible energy of what is known. Now, to suggest that logos might be read or heard as referring to a range of behaviors may sound a little strange. But I've argued elsewhere that one of the deepest cultural problems of our day is the assumption that a certain limited range of linguistic and representational behaviors, concentrating on causal analysis, repeatable manipulation, and the search for some fundamental level of causality, is what constitutes truthful knowing. hard knowledge, as scientists like to say. A telling use of words. But in fact, to pick up a theme developed by phenomenologists in the tradition of Merleau-Ponty, knowing an object in our habitual and unreflective understanding may well include a diversity of sense experience and habitual physical response. The clues and prompts given by taste or touch or smell, all part of our capacity to recognize and map an environment in which we're finding our way as material agents. All, therefore, in some sense, logos. There is here no substitute for the time it takes to learn such habits of recognition, no timeless, compact digest of criteria to be marshalled in the concept-forming mind. Ask yourself, what would substitute for the way the sense of smell works in identifying decayed or infected food or incipient fire? How do you verbalize? A rational connectedness with the material environment, in other words, is one that would include appropriate awareness, even if not a conceptually refined translation, of such habits of educated response. But in another way to understand human knowing, we need to imagine what we might call an educated body. I refer here not only to Merleau-Ponty's own work, but to the excellent discussion by Orion Edgar in his monograph on Merleau-Ponty, where he speaks about eating as a form of knowing. But that's another story. Anyway, how does this relate to the picture so far sketched? What I've called educated sense or sensibility implies a physical, ultimately a neural capacity to connect diverse experiences and make of them a coherent pattern. It's a kind of intelligence, in the sense that intelligence identifies connectable form, consistent patterning in diverse phenomena. Bodies gradually accumulating reasonable habits do just this. And this in turn means that intelligence is naturally working with a spectrum of different kinds of difference, a spectrum of ways in which one substance may be active in another, one set of coherent actions moulding the shape of the act and identity of another. The point is that the way in which a material substance, say, repeats itself, is precisely this spectrum of impacts and transactions through bodily engagement, which produce in the knowing subject a set of apt or congruent behaviors whose success and sustainability through changing and challenging circumstances demonstrate the reality of the contact with a real otherness. Correspondence to reality, as a definition of truthfulness, means the range of sustainable response activated in a knower in contact with a known object, not simply a set of checkable statements about an object, a range of sustainable response. Now, put this in the light of what's been discussed earlier about the Trinitarian life, and what comes into focus, I think, is this. The universe we know is a system in which coherent and durable patterns of energy, intelligible forms, if you want a philosophical term, characteristically generate in other such forms a version of their own pattern of life. And in the case of intelligent, language-using subjects, this generated version spreads across a range of activities from physical habit to mental representation of various sorts, picturing, mathematical modeling, verbal symbolization, and so on. This is how, in the finite world, a substance corresponds to itself, repeats itself, that is known. This is how it is truly received. So in rethinking our epistemology to escape from the tyranny of a representation confined to one limited canonical mode, say mathematical modeling, claimed as the fundamental form of true knowledge, we need not only a participatory model of knowledge, as an increasing number of thinkers would agree, go and read Andrew Davison, but more specifically, a model that understands the shape of finite reality itself as non-identical repetition, grounded in the truth that the source of finite reality is the non-identical repetition that is the divine life, the Trinitarian life. To speak of what is actual is always to speak of this. What is always necessarily action that generates its reflection in difference. We've heard already some illuminating reflections on the primacy of action as a category here. I want to gloss that and say that the action which we're attending to here, the action which has its root in the divine action, is action that generates its reflection in difference. That is the foundation of our ontology and our epistemology in the Trinitarian framework. Well, to say that these are complex and speculative ideas is obvious, but it's important to try and set out how a Trinitarian ontology might mandate a particular approach to epistemology so as to clarify a central and pivotal concern for any theologically inflected philosophy. That is, the need to challenge reductive models of knowing which assume the normative status of non-relational, descriptive and external modes of understanding, and fail, therefore, to deal with the mutual implication of knower and known. If the foundational rhythm of reality is, so to speak, utterance and resonance and enhanced utterance, then it is not merely the case that language represents reality. Reality itself is linguistic in the sense that intelligible communication is ultimately what there is. Intelligible communication is what there is, because that's the Trinity. And this in turn is not just to say that fundamental reality communicates what it is. Mutual communication, the life of reality in what it is not, and the simultaneous return of that what it is not to what it repeats, is the most basic characterization of being that we can offer. It's not a theme that's found many modern theological explorers, but we've already heard one or two references in this discussion to the work of Sergei Bulgakov, especially his chapters on the Trinity. And I know you'll be hearing more about that from another speaker in this conference. But Bulgakov sketches just such a linguistic account of Trinitarian life, seeing the relation of subject, predicate, and copula as a reflection of the grammar of divinity. But I'll pass over that for the moment. I've suggested in another discussion that truthful representation is a notion that needs to include all forms of appropriate and sustainable responses to the environment in which intelligence is at work. As I've said, logos is a range of behaviors. And in this sense, a certain kind of habit may constitute, for some purposes, a truthful representation. The exercise of a skill like wood carving or violin playing involves the body in showing how an instrument is constructed and how it can effectively operate. The skill tells us something true. Its successful exercise is the meeting place of identities realized in each other. And the tool or instrument is meaningless independently of its activation in this particular mode, and the craftsman or performer is informed by the possibilities of the tool or instrument and acquires new definition through this formative relation, and in so doing exhibits both their own identity and that of the object used. And that, I'm suggesting, implies a telling the truth about the material worked on, the literally material stuff of wood being carved, or the matter of musical relations and frequencies. Another definitive frontier between identity and otherness opens up. So that truth-telling, the activity of truth-telling, comes into focus as something involving a whole history of convergences between identities, centered on what could be called a sustainable habit of engagement, an apt response which is effective and generative because it is fitted to the act of what it responds to or represents. As Klaus Hemmeler observed in the celebrated thesis on Trinitarian Ontology, which we've already mentioned, things are only what they are in action. And he writes, this action is a constitution, a communication, a delimitation, and an adaptation to an overarching context. This discussion, if I may try and wrap up briefly because the clock is glaring at me, this discussion has attempted, like Hemmeler, to move a little bit further. The contention is that knowledge is like this, intelligence is like this, because of the basic character of reality as shown in the Trinitarian life of God. Logos, we all know, is more than word. But what theologians came to say about the eternal Logos, and then about the role of Logos in the processes of human condition and conscious agency, allows us to say that, as Aquinas seems to assume, our speech, in the broadest sense, is both a clue to thinking about the triune God and a reality comprehensively illuminated by that God. The act of naming, representing, acknowledges the way in which identities call out for vehicles that will manifest their non-identity, that will repeat them in a correspondence that is not just static reproduction. The world calls to be spoken. I have to leave a few sections out here, but just to attempt to wrap up. We were reminded yesterday, forcefully, of the need for apophatic awareness in all this. None of the discussion I've been sharing should be taken as an attempt to anatomize the divine life in itself. My purpose is just to clarify what's entailed by the claim that our own intelligence and love image their divine origin. What Hemmeler calls the discovery of my knowing self in all that I know, the discovery of my knowing self in all that I know, is the finite echo of the truth that infinite agency is a self-differentiation and identity in otherness. And this is above all shown in the event of Jesus, the human life in which the internal reciprocity of God with God and the overflow or excess of that reciprocity is spelled out in temporal sequence, as the gift of the Father to the incarnate Son by the bestowal of the Spirit, the gift of the Son to the Father in obedient love, and the gift of the Spirit to the Church, a process in which each divine agent bears truthful witness to the other, as the farewell discourses in John's Gospel explain. We are able to understand this idea of divine witness in the context of historical narrative. We have no resource that will enable us to conceptualize what this witness means in eternity, except to say that it is the way in which God exercises indivisibly the love and intelligence of which we are the created shadows. And if the whole structure of this argument is correct, then our knowing of the triune God is in any case not the construction of a conceptual framework, but the exercise of logos, the range of practices and habits that are apt, that are fitting in a life that fits with the constraining, defining reality of God's being. A knowing that is first the relation of self-forgetfulness in the face of the divine, the carrying of the cross, and the filial prayer, Abba, Father. Which is what a theologian like Vladimir Lossky meant by insisting that negative theology could not be understood as just a moment in the verbal negotiation of what you could and couldn't say about God, a phase in the to and fro of definitional ventures. It had rather to be grasped as a habit of faithful living, an apt response to divine agency. So rethinking logos, infinite and finite for our times, is thus a matter of thinking together God's self-correspondence, God's truthfulness to God, with our own self-discovery in what we know, and our attempts not only to create truthful formulation of what we encounter, but to develop a sustainable lived response to it. And thinking of Simon Kotfer's paper yesterday, of course, part of that is the development of an apt and sustainable response to the stuff of which we are part in a finite world. Again, another story. The more we elucidate what is meant by God's self-correspondence in the Trinitarian life, the meaning of terms like word and wisdom and image, the more we understand how language, generously defined, is ontologically basic. The more we clarify what our own knowledge as finite intelligences involve, the more we see that intelligence and speech, again generously defined, not excluding symbolic and communicative gesture, are not inexplicable or gratuitous outgrowths on the body of solidly atomistic material realities. Bringing these intellectual exercises together is a complex business, but it is, so I've been arguing, a necessary task in a climate of debased accounts of human intellect and a nervousness about religiously moulded metaphysics. I've tried to suggest that it is ultimately scriptural talk of God that prompts the particular trajectory we've been considering. And the emerging ontology and epistemology, so far from making our discourse more abstract, in fact reinforces the centrality of practice and of material location and temporality. Appropriately, perhaps, this is a metaphysic that proposes incarnation and kenosis to finite subjects as the ground of truthfulness, just as they are the form taken by divine truthfulness, divine self-correspondence in God's incarnate speech to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful and very generative paper. We now have... Sorry, Ryan. Ryan is gesturing to me wildly.
That I get the first question.
I see, I see.
It's time for questions, I believe.
Over to you.
I don't want to make this about myself, but I'm going to, if I may for a moment. Those were all wonderful papers, but my questions for Professor Chalamet. Two things. First, I wholly agree with your description of John as one of the towering theological figures of our time, but in all fairness, I think Rowan could be said to be one too. Thank you for quoting me, lavish. I have a question for you, but I'm going to filter it through an apologetic for myself, and I'll try to be very quick. You chasten me, you make me realize that sometimes when I get carried away in the preposterous fluidity of my prose, I may venture incautious formulations. So let me assure you, I do believe that Christians have to deal with metaphysics and have to engage in a metaphysics of being as being. I would even say that I can't make the kind of distinction between revelation and reasoning that I thought I depicted, that I thought I detected in your talk. I would even say that as a formulation that you can find variously expressed by Maximus the Confessor and Hegel and Stephen R. L. Clark, that the Trinity and perhaps even the Incarnation are truths of reason. So if I can just make sure I understood what you were saying, there is a kind of metaphysics that can genuinely be characterized as hierarchy within totality, right, in which being as yet has not been thought analogically or even distinct from the notion of a descending hierarchy of hypostases within a continuum of causes. We see this in the Alexandrian subordinationism that was shared not only by Christians but by Jewish and pagan thinkers. Maybe we see it in Wolffian, Leibnizian metaphysics. I believe that you were quoting a paper of mine called The Destiny of Christian Metaphysics, which would presume, if you take the title seriously, it would suggest that metaphysics, Christian metaphysics, has a destiny, right? That it's precisely the interruption of that continuum by the definition of the co-equality of the persons, in which the subordinationist scheme that gave us a tidy metaphysics, but a univocal metaphysics uniting God as the being at the top of the pyramid of beings to everything below. Once that's disrupted, it liberates Christian thought to think in terms of being as being, because the act of creation becomes ever more mysterious. It's the direct communication of being from the wellspring of all being, which is more intimate to us than our inmost selves and farther beyond our utmost, right? You know, it's transcendent of everything. I don't see how that can't be characterized as a metaphysics. And I'm also not sure how revelation can be received as revelation without also a sort of a prior intentionality that allows it to be interpreted, which requires a metaphysical frame. It would seem to me, if we're dealing with questions about the origin of all things, the source of all reality. Or to boil this down, not that this was your intention, but please don't make me sound too much like Karl Barth. And could you tell me could you clarify for me how you understand the relationship between metaphysics and revelation, or the distinction between an ontology and a metaphysics of being as being?
I was really hoping the questions would be addressed to my colleagues to my left. Well, that's the massive question that you raise. Thank you for it. I did not want to depict you as an anti-metaphysician, I know, but as someone who sees potential problems with certain forms of metaphysics. That's all I tried to say in the paper. My paper was short because my main concern this morning was to leave enough time to my colleagues, to my distinguished colleagues. No, but we do have to talk together about this relation between metaphysics and revelation. I believe that it is before all of our questions, even before all of our questions about being, theology, of course that's a bottom move, theology begins with God's question to us, which reframes everything, reframes all of our questions. And so our questions, of course we have our questions that are prior, that are a sort of framework, but does that framework help us understand revelation? That's the question. The Vorverständnis question, the Anknüpfungspunkt question that was dealt with in detail in the 20th century. And here, I must say, I feel quite close to Karl Barth's decisions, theological decisions, to say that the very conditions of possibility of acknowledging revelation, Erkenntnis, are provided within the act of revelation. So that would be a quick, perhaps insufficient answer, but that's where I stand in a way, theologically, on this question. Yeah.
Okay, we had a question at the back here from Martin Bieler.
It's for Christophe Chalamet. The late Karl Barth once said that he doesn't contend the fact that God can be known through creation, but he doubts that there is a subject who is able to do just that. Yesterday, Philip Rosemann spoke of the two books, the book of nature, which can no longer be read by us, sinners, so to speak, and on the other hand, the book of scripture, which enables to read the book of nature again, which would be, I think, an adequate answer to Barth. So I wonder how you relate to what Philip Rosemann said. Do you think the book of scripture makes the book of nature readable again? Or should we just leave out the book of nature?
No, I share that position. The book of scripture opens our eyes to reading.
So do you just understand in the sense of the Lichterlehre, the teaching of lights in Karl Barth?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think it works, but you know.
Well, we don't live too far away from each other. We could discuss that.
Down here, Ryan. We still have a good amount of time for questions. So we had a question down here from the front. And then next, we'll go with Emily in the corner over there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your talks. When I compare your two papers, John Betz always underlined necessity of the self to give up oneself, to find one's own identity in the other, by the other, through the other. So love is the moment which counts. And when I see the paper of the Archbishop, then you have the idea the self is quite important. There's self-correspondence, self-relating. Truth is created in the Trinity by this self-relating moment in God, in the Trinity. Then maybe at the end we have two different concepts we can even see discussed in the Middle Ages. For Thomas Aquinas, for instance, there's a certain kind of priority of the or the logic priority of the Father. The Father generates. He is not so content with the idea that there is a generation and therefore there is a Father. So he wants to be sure that there's a personalistic understanding of the Trinity, that always the persons are acting. So first is the Father. Well, we have to, it's difficult to speak first and second, but first there's a person of the Father who generates, and then there's the Son. So there is a kind of priority of the Father's identity before the Son, although sure they exist in a certain kind of reciprocity. On the other hand, so this idea of this personalistic understanding of the Trinity corresponds, I would say, more to the paper of the Archbishop, where the self is important, the self corresponds to itself. On the other hand, if I take your paper, then you have more this idea of Balthasar and others, where the self has or you can justify the self only giving one's up, rendering itself to the other. Otherwise, the self is something negative or is not really melting its identity, giving the own identity to the other. To some extent, it seems to be like a Buddhistic understanding that the self is a problem. The self has always to be overwhelmed, is something which we have to transcend. Otherwise, it's something negative. Perhaps you could comment what I tried to explain.
It's an enormous question that you raise, and to my mind, it's one of those questions which any attempt to answer leads into what I think of as one of those impossible objects you sometimes see in books, the Möbius strip or the Escher structure, which is actually impossible. You can't find a place of starting that will just get you there. I take the point about the way in which I threw the word self around, and it would take me, I think, quite a long time to dig myself out of that hole completely successfully to avoid an impression that the divine life is somehow, in any possible sense, primitively one and then something else. That's not it, because on the Möbius strip principle, as soon as you have said that the generation of the Son by the Father presupposes the Father, you are presupposing that generation is what constitutes that self-identity. Identity itself is, as it were, problematized or even dissolved in that process. So I don't think there is an easy way out of this. I'd like to hear Ron on this, but what you call the Buddhistic dimension of an unequivocally kenotic or ecstatic perspective. I think yes and no to that, in that even in Buddhist terms, there is a place from which you see or act. The illusion from which you have to be delivered is that place from which you see it act is something which can be circumscribed and atomized finally and successfully. It is always conditioned. It's nonetheless a place, but it's a place because of its conditioning. Now, I don't imagine that, I don't want to speak for you here, I don't imagine that you're suggesting that there's something intrinsically not only problematic but almost evil about the concept of selfhood.
Not at all.
But I suspect we may be more at one than you think, in that we're both, I think, saying that as soon as you've understood that the action of any divine hypostasis is absolutely, intrinsically, irreducibly the act of self-communication or bestowal, then I think the distinctions begin to move away. But
yes, I'd like to thank you, Williams. That's a wonderful question. Picking up on what Lord Williams said, I would want to say that indeed I don't believe there is any naked self. That in the true selfhood is already communicative, and to be a self at all is to be in relation, just at the natural level. But then when we go to the Trinitarian level, I don't want to say, I really don't want to say that there is, the Father has some identity before the Son. I mean, I think we have to avoid that, for very good dogmatic reasons. The Father does not have an identity before the generation. I mean, otherwise we're back into some kind of subordinationist model of some sort. That the Father's identity consists in his paternity, in his self-communication. So I think I do not want to suggest that the self in itself is something negative. Rather, I mean, we are underway to that perfect selfhood that we find within the life of the Trinity.
If I can just add one more thought on that. Part of the problem of talking about the life of the Holy Trinity is, of course, that we can't stop ourselves, as it were, telling stories. The story of the generation of the Son by the Father, the story of the aspiration of the Spirit. And we, if we're doing our theology properly, we always rein ourselves in and say, but I don't mean sequence, I don't mean. And so we seem to be stuck with trying to tell a story without sequence. And that's one of those profoundly tension-inducing, irreducibly contradictory things that we are stuck with when we're attempting to speak of that reality which our minds are incapable of conceptualizing. But, as Augustine said, ne taceratur. You have to find the least stupid thing you can to say about all this.
This question closely follows on from the last one. And first of all, though, thank you very much, Rowan, for absolutely magnificent short summary of what I think we're all driving towards. And I felt what you were saying was very consonant with what I've been saying. My question is really about the 4 R's: relation, repetition, reflection, and return. And my question is really whether reflection is compatible with the other 3. I'm very, very glad that you're introducing repetition alongside relation, because I think this is absolutely essential. But the question about reflection is the question really about whether this is too Hegelian, because the Neoplatonists, didn't allow intelligence into the one precisely because intelligence was reflective. Now, it seems to me that it's possible to argue that the Trinity is resolving that problem because a substantial relation isn't actually reflective. It's not that the Son is reflecting the Father, unless you really qualify that, because as John's just said, and you've agreed, there isn't an identity of the Father before the Son. So it's somehow not a straightforward mirroring. And therefore, I think it's significant that if there is return involved in the Trinity, and I think there is, that it's only by way of the third. It's not because the Son mirrors back the Father to the Father, but because they both generate something else, and thereby that goes back. But even that going back isn't really a reflection, because in the straightforward sense, because it's only a going back by further going outwards. So, the only way I would want to qualify what you're saying is sort of perhaps getting rid of that reflection language, or at least massively qualifying it. Thank you.
Really interesting point, I think. My use of reflection language is partly because it's there in Scripture and in the deuterocanonical material. It's almost routine in a lot of patristic theology. But I entirely take the point. And I think one thing I'd want to say, very much in direct response to your challenge and proposal, is that, of course, what breaks open the notion of reflection in the Trinitarian context is that if, in some sense, the Son is the repetition of the Father, part of what the Son repeats, and therefore in some sense reflects, is the generativity of the Father. And therefore you're out of the, you're out, and you're also away from what Losky used to call the égoïsme à deux of a father-son reciprocity, which is locked in itself, precisely because we're talking about a global divine generativity, which is part of what it is to be God here. Then any reflection has to be more than simply that, what I think you're complaining about is a static mirroring of some sort. A doubling, yes. Yeah, fine.
Emily Kempson, University of Cambridge. Thank you all for your papers. I am going to have to limit myself to one question for Rowan. I really appreciated your treatment of truth and expansion of what it is to be truth or exist in logos to more than just propositional or cognitive elements, but to the entire embodied way of life. I want to ask you about the relational aspect of truth, because you talked about how that truthfulness remains correspondence to reality, sort of broadly, loosely put. And I'm wondering if you see truth really exclusively only in those relational elements, or also possibly in the substantive existence of things, which is sort of something being true in itself. And I realize that existing in relation and resisting in yourself is the same Mobius strip of turning back on itself, but in the Trinity we do distinguish between the relational names of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, as we've been talking about, and the names which they all share, such as being and goodness and wisdom. And so the question is, if truth can also have that substantive distinction, can it be that sort of name that they all have? And perhaps one way to go at it would be, how does talking about the truth of the Trinity relate to talking about God as wisdom, and in sort of a comparison between those two? Can it go beyond correspondence in relation to that reality itself? Thank you.
Gosh, thank you. I really am going to have to think about that, so I'm not going to offer a quick answer here. It's a really interesting question. My immediate instinct is simply to say, I'm not quite sure how I would really pull apart the relational and whatever else we're talking about, in that truth or the divine beauty or the divine wisdom are themselves always active, always real, in and only in relatedness. And even when you're trying to characterize something which is apparently a non-relational term, the truth that is there is always a truth to and with. But sorry, yes, I'll just have to think about it. But thank you, I'll drop it in somewhere.
Now, I believe we have time for one more question. And Ryan, have you found somebody? Okay.
Vittorio Hösle, I would like to ask a question to Rowan Williams. You very convincingly started your lecture with showing, in a certain sense, the transcendental presuppositions of the intelligibility of the world. We can have claims to truth only because in God there is a unity of being and knowledge, a being that mirrors itself in some form of knowledge, connecting it to De Veritate of Aquinas. Does not our discourse on a Trinitarian ontology be enriched if we start from the fact that in the normal knowledge process, it's not simply a subject-object relation, but a relation between two different subjects who do not relate to each other simply as an object of cognition, but as a co-subject. And if we introduce this epistemic model, do we not have a richer jumping starting point to get to a Trinitarian ontology? Erik Gustav Geijer, the famous Swedish theologian whose statue you find in Uppsala in front of a library, famously said, German idealism thought that subject and object are the basic categories, but I and thou are irreducible to them, and that is the core of Christian theology, philosophical theology.
That's a very helpful qualification, I think, of what I was saying. Yes, the subject-object dichotomy, in fact, presupposes a huge amount about selfhood and about certain models of knowledge as acquisition, if you're not careful. To speak, as I tentatively tried to do, of a world which calls out to be known or to be spoken is perhaps one way of beginning to do justice to the perspective you're introducing here. And I'm very happy to recognize that as part of what needs to be done to take that forward. Because, just briefly, again, one of the fallacies I keep coming back to in moaning on about our contemporary confusions about the nature of knowledge is that persistent and lethal assumption that activity is going on in here and out there is something that is fundamentally dead. Get away from that, and the thing really does begin to open up theologically as well as philosophically.
Would you join me in thanking our speakers? We will now have a half-an-hour break, and there will be coffee and biscuits outside. May I just ask that anybody who has arrived today but has not registered, come and meet me on the registration desk in the foyer. Thank you very much.